I'm on. There we are. Happy Sabbath, everyone. I was telling Emily before the service started, I was like, I don't know how I'm going to follow all of this. We had such a wonderful praise set, and then we had this beautiful special music. Brian, thank you for the children's story. It's just been a good Sabbath already. We've already been blessed. And now I'm supposed to come up here and talk at you all? I don't know, something doesn't feel right about that, but here we are. The sermon title is not Independence. That was last week, given that we were anticipating the 4th of July. This Sabbath, we're talking about broken and blessed. And that's our word for today, is blessed. So for kids, for those who feel like kids, the young in spirit, I believe there's a prize, Suzette. Is that correct? If you catch the number of times that I say the word blessed, we're going to include blessing in there as well, because I think Sabbath, at some level, is a blessing that we experience today. And there's stories in the Bible that are all about blessing. And so my hope this morning is that we unpack that a little bit, we tell a story, and we examine a character who is blessed a couple times in his life. But it's not only blessing in his story. The story that we're going to be talking about today begins like this. It says, "And then Jacob was alone." And how did we get to this point where Jacob is alone? You may ask yourself, where are we in the narrative? Allow me to recap just a little bit. If you're maybe a little fuzzy on who this Jacob character is, Jacob is the second-born son of Isaac, the second-born of his father Abraham. And so we have this character, Jacob, who from the moment he's born, from the moment he is a thought in his parents' head, there are expectations placed on him. There's a prophecy that comes to Jacob's mom, Rebekah, that says the younger or the older will serve the younger. And so the wonder is, what will this younger child be like? What will they do? What will they be? What's their personality going to be like? Will they be fun? Will they be harsh? Will they be organized? Will they be a little scattered? But in the midst of all of that, there's this overwhelming statement from God to the parents: the younger will be in charge of the older. And so I imagine as Jacob and his brother Esau grow up, there is always a little bit of edge and competitiveness, just like there would be normally between siblings. But with this, there's a little added push, because when God says something, we tend to try to fall in line with that. I imagine that as Jacob grows up, he begins to hear about a blessing down the road, a blessing that his father will give to one of the sons, probably Esau, but with this idea of the older serving the younger, it would make more sense if Jacob, in fact, received the blessing. So Jacob begins to develop, begins to learn, begins to observe, and realizes rather quickly that, in this family, the truth is a convenience. It is a luxury that maybe we can't always afford. Perhaps you heard the story of his grandfather Abraham lying to multiple kings about his grandmother's relationship. Are they sisters and brothers? Are they husband, wife? Who's to say? Later on, as they grow up, Jacob, in fact, swindles his own brother out of the birthright, trades him a pot of stew for the birthright. And it works. This manipulation, this scheme works for Jacob. So guess what we're going to do next time? In fact, the story right before the blessing of Jacob is a story where Isaac talks to a foreign king, and he says, hey, this person next to me, she's not my wife, she's actually my sister. He takes a play right out of his own father's playbook, and it works. So for Jacob, this is the family that he grows up in. This is the pattern that he develops. This is the behavior that he works with. So when the day comes that the blessing is going to be given, it only makes sense that for Jacob, there's a little bit of deception, a little bit of manipulation. What ends up happening is Jacob disguises himself as his brother Esau. He puts on a disguise, goes before his father, receives the blessing from Isaac, and breaks his relationship with his brother. His brother's last words to him are, "I will kill you for what you've done to me." In the quest for blessing, Jacob breaks his family. He breaks the marriage of his parents. He breaks his brother's relationship with him, and he ends up having to flee from this space. So although he's blessed, he has broken a lot of things along the way. This is sort of the first chapter of Jacob's story. Along the way, as he runs away, he's all alone by himself, and he meets God in this space, all alone. In a dream where there's a ladder going up and down between heaven and earth, Jacob meets God. But the story doesn't end there. You see, the blessing that he's been given starts to come true. He goes, he meets some family from not too far away. He gets married, and as he begins to have kids and develop his job as a shepherd, the blessing starts to come through. He has kids. He has wealth. He has more and more and more than he can even possibly dream of. And that blessing that he has received, it's happening. And in the midst of that blessing occurring, Jacob meets his mirror in his uncle Laban. Laban is just as deceitful, just as manipulative, just as much of a liar as Jacob. And we see that brokenness continues to follow Jacob to the point where Jacob says, you know what, we need to leave. We need to run away from Laban. We need to take off, go to a different land, and there we will be happy. There, maybe the blessing will finally be what it's supposed to be. And that's where we pick up our story. Jacob, running away from his uncle, has a few wives, more kids, more livestock than any young man should have. But he hears that his brother's on the way. Esau, the last person Jacob really wants to see, is on the way with an army, which typically isn't the thing that somebody who's friendly carries with them. So Jacob, afraid, alone, sits, waits, and wonders. The last time he was alone, he met God. This time, he's hoping not to meet Esau. And in Genesis chapter 32, verse 24, it says that Jacob was alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go until you bless me." And the man said, "What's your name?" And Jacob said, "My name is Jacob." Then the man said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven against God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." The man said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there the man blessed Jacob. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because God touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. It's a pretty weird story. cover a lot of ground in there. But it's an odd one. It kind of stands out from the rest. If you were to read this sort of journeying through, there's a man who wrestles with Jacob. But sort of the punch of the story, if you were to continue on, seems to occur in the next chapter where Jacob meets his brother Esau, and there's this whole bit of forgiveness that occurs, and it's a really beautiful end to the tale of Jacob and Esau. But I want to talk about this story today because I think that there's something to be learned in the wrestling with God. Now, I don't know about you, but this idea of wrestling with God is a little uncomfortable for me. It's not something that I do often, in fact, ever. I don't think I can sit down and put myself in a space where, on Tuesday last week, I sat and God and I wrestled all night long, and that was my Tuesday night. That hasn't really happened to me. But here we see Jacob, alone, waiting, wondering, when a man shows up and begins to fight with him. This man we later know as God, or Jacob identifies as God. So my question for you this morning, my challenge for you this morning, are you ready for God to show up and wrestle with you? Because note in this story, it is not Jacob who initiates the wrestling. It is not Jacob who goes out looking for God because he's got something on his heart. It's God that shows up, rings the bell twice, ting, ting, and then round one starts. It's God who starts this. It's God who shows up to Jacob and begins fighting with him, begins pushing him. And it says that this isn't just a 1 round or 2 round thing. They go all night long to the point that the day starts to occur. The sunrise is happening when the fight ends. So when God shows up this afternoon, this evening, tomorrow, and begins to wrestle with you, don't think it's going to be a short round. Don't expect this to be something really small, or that, 5 minutes, we'll get through it in a prayer and on the way to the next. I think in some ways, this is a lot like our journey with God. As we walk with God, there's going to be moments when we walk side by side. There's going to be moments when we follow right behind God. But this story tells me that there's another piece, another chapter to the walk with God, and that includes wrestling with God at times. To be able to sit, to be able to struggle, to be able to wonder. Because at some point in your walk with God, there will be a moment where God looks at you and says, you know that thing that you've been carrying around, that thing that you rely on, it's time to let that go. I want you to examine with me the story of Jacob for a moment. This man, this son, this brother, was all about himself. At the end of the day, there was only one person who would stand up for Jacob, and that's Jacob. There's only one person who gets stuff done for Jacob, and it's Jacob. Jacob has to worry, he has to struggle, he has to manipulate. His very name means heel in Hebrew, and the idea is that to grab somebody's heel is to pull them down, to manipulate, to scheme, to lie, to coerce, to take advantage of, to pull at somebody's weakness to get ahead. This is what Jacob, his identity is attached to, and his actions confirm. Jacob relies on himself, on his own strength, on his own power, on his own ability. And if I stare into the mirror long enough, I recognize that same behavior in me. Perhaps you too recognize a little bit of Jacob in you. The need to put myself first, to rely on my strength first. What I love about this story is that after the struggle, after the wrestling, after the day is starting to break, God unveils perhaps his strongest move. something I wouldn't do. I would lead with this if I was God, but that's, I guess, why I'm not God. God waits until the end, till we're almost done fighting, and then God starts the real fight as he touches the leg of Jacob. Now, in the English translations, this is often translated as like the hip socket, the hip bone that gets like popped out of place. And I did some research on this because that's a pretty intense injury. I've never had anything happen to my leg other than a small injury to my knee. But I can't imagine not having my whole hip just pop out of place. I did 1 year of anatomy and physiology at PAA, so I'm pretty much an expert in this. And so from that immense research, the hip bone is pretty important, and that socket is pretty important. So to lose that power, to lose that ability, is to impact one's entire livelihood. I want you to imagine for a moment, your hip isn't in where it's supposed to be. That's going to change everything that you do in life. Every action that you commit, the ability to walk, the ability to carry, the ability to lift, the ability to move, the ability to lay down, all connected to this. I say all of this knowing that the Hebrew probably doesn't actually refer to the hip bone. The Hebrew here is actually pretty vague. The word that we typically translate as socket, reality is that word is it's used much more to talk about the palm of your hand, which for those of you that are in the medical field, there's a lot of bones in your hand, but this area is a lot more fleshy. There's a lot of bones in here, but it tends to be a little more of a fleshy spot. Furthermore, when we get to the end of this story, we see that Jacob, when he tells his sons all of this story, that their conclusion isn't we don't eat part of the bone, it's we don't eat a sinew, like a tendon or a ligament. We don't eat that. So when we look at this story, when we read it, it seems much more likely that what is touched, what is impacted, is probably a tendon, a ligament of some sort that would impact Jacob's ability to move around. In either case, whatever injury it is that Jacob sustains here, it is severe enough that he leaves the place limping. Additionally, the injury is severe enough and God doesn't heal it. This is one of the rare examples in Scripture where God causes an injury but doesn't heal it. It's the only one that I can find at this point where God instigates something. It's like the reverse of Jesus' entire ministry. Jesus is the one who shows up and he heals the injuries that already exist. In this case, God shows up, touches Jacob, and makes something that was whole broken. That's challenging to me. That's very challenging to me because it makes me uncomfortable about what happens when God shows up and wrestles with me and says, hey, there's something you've been relying on, something that you use, something that is maybe helpful to you even, and I'm going to change that. I'm going to mess it up a little bit. I'm going to take it away even. I don't really like that thought. But it's here, and it's something to reckon with. Because I think there's truth in that. In the walk with Christ, in the journey with Jesus that you are all on today, there are things that Jesus looks at, I believe, and he says, you gotta give up. There is a cost in this walk to follow me. Jesus doesn't say, pick up your pillow and follow me. Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me. This is a costly decision. It is a painful decision to follow Jesus. Jesus says that the road is narrow and difficult, not wide and easy. And in this story with Jacob, I believe that to the man who is all about self-reliance and his own strength, when God shows up and wrestles with him and touches his leg, his hip, There's an element in which God is saying, Jacob, your own strength, it's not even good enough. This need to manipulate, this need to enforce your own will, your own strength, that's not it. That's not what it looks like to follow me today. And from this place going forward, Jacob, your life's going to be entirely different and not necessarily easier for you. And in many ways, I think this is the same invitation God gives us today. That as you walk, as you wrestle, as we journey, we enter into a space where God may take something from us. Our strength, our abilities. And it may not be right away that is restored. I imagine that in this moment, Jacob's entire life changes. In this pain that he experiences, he doesn't do the thing that I would do, which is I would crumple. Like, I step on a Lego and that's the day for me. I can't do anything else. We're done. Jacob loses one of his legs in this moment. Just pow, right there. And he's done. But in that moment, Jacob's reaction is to grab onto his opponent and basically say, you're going to drag me around until you bless me. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Which is fascinating to me because Jacob at this point has already received a blessing from his father. So what is it in Jacob that needs to be blessed? Why does he need this? And interestingly enough, the story doesn't continue with a blessing. It continues with a renaming. The man says to Jacob, what is your name? The man says, Jacob, liar, thief, heel, manipulator, deceiver. That's who I am. Then the man, the opponent, God, says, your name shall no longer be Jacob. It will no longer be all of these things that you associate yourself with, but you will be called Israel, which literally means he who strives with God, he who wrestles, he who struggles with God. And the man unpacks this to say that, yes, Jacob, you have struggled with God and with man, and Jacob, you've already won. You've already prevailed. You have already overcome. In this moment, I think that the blessing received, although there is this mentioning that the man does then in fact bless Jacob, part of the blessing is this renaming of Jacob to Israel. There's a statement of the identity which you identify yourself with. That is no longer who I see you to be. That is no longer who God sees you today. So, in this story, we have a broken man, a man who hurts, a man who wonders, a man who walks alone, blessed and broken. Originally, breaking things to achieve blessing. In this story, brokenness is a reminder of blessing. I imagine that when Jacob goes forward from this day, he's got 11 kids at this point, that every day one of his kids goes, hey, pick me up today, Dad. Let me sit on your lap. Every time his leg twinges that little bit, every time it strikes just a little bit, that shooting pain. For Jacob, it's the reminder, just as much of the pain that he carries, it is a reminder of the fact that he's no longer Jacob, but Israel. I imagine that he hears this voice, you are no longer Jacob, but Israel today. So how does this apply to us? Great, good story for Israel, for Jacob, awesome. How does it apply to us today? Well, we're going to flip to the other end of the Bible, to Revelation. And I promise we're not going to start a new sermon there. Just a small thought. One verse. John writes to some churches, and to the church of Pergamum, Jesus says these words. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. That's you all here today. To the one who conquers, to the one who overcomes, to the one who has already prevailed, I will give him some of the hidden manna I will provide, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on it that no one knows except the one who receives it. The Scottish theologian George MacDonald says this about the hidden stone, and I love this so much. And the white stone, the gift of the white stone, represents God looking at fallen humanity, broken humanity, and blessed humanity, and says, here's who I've always seen you to be, and here you are today in full fruition as that. Well done, good and faithful servant. Way to fight the good fight, to wrestle through the struggles and be blessed amongst them. My invitation this morning, now this afternoon, wrestle with God today and know that you've already won and are blessed.